Okay, welcome back. And now I believe we're turning to the advisory opinion from Burrillville tax assessor and Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The town calls Glen Walker, consultant for the tax assessor to the state. Do you want to swear him in?
Yes.
Would you please identify yourself?
My name is Glen Walker.
And were you retained by the town of Burrillville to prepare an advisory opinion to this board on behalf of the Burrillville tax assessor?
Yes.
And did you research and prepare an advisory opinion regarding the possible potential impacts of the proposed Clear River Energy Center on property values in Burrillville?
Yes.
Is that analysis dated September 8th, 2016, filed with this board on September 9th, 2016?
Yes.
Did the tax assessor adopt your analysis as her advisory opinion to this board?
Yes, that's my opinion. Or that's my understanding.
And are you adopting that analysis under oath here today as your testimony in this matter?
Yes.
For the record, that document has been marked as Burrillville Exhibit 28. I believe we're going to keep the Burrillville numbers on it. Do you have any corrections you need to make?
No.
I will turn Mr. Walker over for cross-examination. Thank you.
The CLF has no questions for this witness.
OER has no questions.
Energy has a few questions. Good afternoon, Mr. Walker.
Good afternoon.
As a licensed appraiser, you're subject to certain rules that preclude you from being influenced or predisposed in your assessment. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you say at a couple of places in your report, actually page 1 and page 47, you make reference to the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, or USPAP.
Yes.
Correct? And you point out that your report and what you've done is subject to the requirements or the guidelines of USPAP, correct?
Correct.
And you recognize this?
That appears to be a copy of USPAP.
Right. This is the current version, the 2018-2019 version?
It appears to be, yes.
And am I correct that the USPAP is a body of guidelines that include appraisal standards for developing and reporting of appraisal or consulting assignments?
Yeah, there are various standards with respect to whether you're acting as an appraiser or providing consulting, but yes, there are a set of standards.
And there are also ethical requirements, correct?
Correct.
And I see from your CV that you're licensed in a number of states, including Rhode Island. Is that correct?
Yes.
As an appraiser.
Yes.
And the USPAP requirements are in fact incorporated into Rhode Island's appraisal licensing statute, correct?
I believe that to be correct, yes.
And it's just for reference, it's RIGL 5-20.7-19, Standards of Practice. A state certified or licensed real estate appraiser must comply with the uniform standards of professional appraisal practice promulgated by the Appraisal Standard Board of the Appraisal Foundation. Does that sound familiar to you?
Sounds approximately right.
And you would be subject to significant penalties if you violated those standards, isn't that right?
Typically there would be penalties, yes.
Right. And that's the subject of RIGL 5-20.7-21, violations and penalties, which would include fines and other sorts of things, correct?
Again, I have not read that statute, but yes, I believe that to be consistent.
Okay. So I'd like to just to ask you about some of the ethical requirements of the USPAP, just to make sure that you're familiar with them. We have an excerpt that we can, I believe, hand out. Oh, there we go. That might be easier.
Next up.
So, tell me if you agree with these as requirements out of USPAP, Mr. Walker. An appraiser must not perform an assignment with bias, correct?
That would be correct.
And you know that under the Code of Ethics, an appraiser must not advocate the cause or interest of any party or issue, right?
That is correct.
You also know that an appraiser must not accept an assignment that includes the reporting of predetermined opinions and conclusions, correct?
Correct.
An appraiser must not accept an assignment or have a compensation arrangement for an assignment that is contingent on the reporting of a predetermined result, correct?
Correct.
And finally, an appraiser must not accept an assignment or have a compensation arrangement for an assignment that is contingent on a direction in assignment results that favors the cause of the client, right?
Correct. Correct.
So that when you're functioning in your capacity as a licensed appraiser, as you are here this afternoon, and in the context of the report that you submitted, you could not and would not allow the fact that the town of Burrillville has adopted a resolution expressly opposing the Clear River project to impact your analysis. Is that correct?
Yeah, and again, I don't know if that resolution was passed when we were retained to do this assignment.
But as you're testifying here today, you are expressly precluded from allowing that resolution or the sentiment expressed in that resolution from affecting your testimony, your assessment, your analysis, correct? And the same would be true of the fact, as testified by Mr. Pacheco in his pre-filed testimony, that the town council is unanimously and unequivocally opposed to Invenergy Thermal Development LLC's application to site and construct the Clear River Energy Center in Burrillville, right?
Right. That would have nothing to do with what I'm doing here today.
Right. So acting in your official capacity as a licensed appraiser, you could not allow that to influence your analysis and opinions, right?
Correct.
All right. All right. You cover a number of subjects that potentially may affect property values in your report. Is that a fair statement?
I believe that to be fair, yes.
Okay. So one of them is potential visual impact, correct?
That is correct, yes.
All right. And you say at page 15 of your report,
This is the first document.
wait a moment until that pops up. Page 15, down toward the bottom, you say, based on the ESS group results, the stacks were the only portion of the proposed facility visible from the various simulation locations. These were modeled to reflect the design intent so that the simulation accurately reflects how the proposed facility will look from the various locations. Did I read that correctly from your report?
Thank you, Victor, yes.
Okay. So let's take a look, if we may, and I know you've got them in your report as well, but since it's our burden, if we could take a look at Exhibit 1, our application, and it's section 6.12.5, visual simulations. We can make that just a little larger so folks can see it. And those are the simulations that you're referring to in your report, correct?
Yeah, right, we put a representative sample in our report, but they came from the ESS group's application to the energy facility siting board.
If we just slide down through those, it becomes a little bit like a game of Where's Waldo to spot the stacks. But this is what you're basing this portion of your opinion on, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So at pages 17, it's at the bottom of 17 to the top of 18, you state in your report, go back to the reporting. I'm going to strain your IT back up, bouncing around, so I do apologize. Wait till we get back to the report. There we go. You state the conclusion of the ESS group study, which is consistent with our expectations, and by our you mean you, correct?
Correct,
Right.
yes.
Which is consistent with our expectations, is that the proposed facility will have minimal visual impact on most locations in the surrounding neighborhoods. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
And could you explain what you mean by consistent with your expectations?
Well, you have a 200-foot stack as proposed, and you're sited on the Burrillville compressor station site, which is a 700 and some odd acre site. Your facility or your proposed facility will will use approximately 60 acres of that site. Based on its location on that site, there will be some visual impacts, but they will be minimal and they will be hidden by the existing buffering or the buffering for the station. And the stacks would be the most visible from a distance.
As reflected in those simulations.
That's correct. I had not seen any other simulations, but that's what they were there to do, was to use for visual simulation of the proposed facility.
Right. And you're accepting the veracity of those simulations, correct?
For purposes of our study, I am in my analysis, yes.
You have no reason to believe that the facility once built will look any different from those perspectives as reflected in those simulations.
The only alternative, the only change might be if the stack height went up. As Mr. Lewis said this morning, if stack heights were 300 feet versus 200, which I think these are, there may be additional visual impacts from a distance.
But if they stay the same, or actually if the stack heights were 195 feet, it would be less.
Maybe 5 feet shorter, yes.
Right. Okay. All right. You also talk about potential noise impact.
I do.
Report. And then on page 20, you say, it is anticipated that the noise level of the proposed facility at all residences will remain reasonably low and less than limits found in most laws, ordinances, regulations, and standards promulgated throughout the U.S. for the control of industrial noise at residential land uses, correct?
And that's what it says, yes.
Right. And when you talk about reasonably low, I assume what you mean by that is in compliance with the noise limits that are imposed on this facility?
That's correct. While I'm not a noise expert, I've been around a lot of power plants, and my expectation would be a facility of this magnitude would have a relatively low noise at the residential property lines.
Very good. I'm going to be bouncing around a bit with your report, so I don't know if our IT person can keep up with us. You have your report there, don't you?
I do.
Great, okay. Your executive summaries at the beginning, one of the things you talk about is increased emissions. That's another subject. That's part of your report that you take into account. And on page 2, with respect to increased emissions, you say, these emissions are considered to be a regional issue, not just a town issue, as state and federal regulations assure no negative impact to the health and welfare of the population close to the proposed facility. Therefore, while there may be a perception that emissions will have a local impact, this is considered to be addressed by the regulations. And by that, do you mean the regulations that impose limits on the emissions from this facility?
That is correct, as my understanding as an appraiser as opposed to an air emissions expert.
Right. But based on your familiarity with power plants, and you certainly, based on your CV, have significant familiarity, you do have a working understanding of what those emission limits are.
That is correct.
Okay. And if we go to page 21 on the same subject, I'll wait till you get there. You say, while it is true that there will be an overall increase in air emissions in the region and the town, there is no reason to believe that emissions from the proposed facility represent a risk to public health and welfare or have an impact on property values if it obtains an air permit. Correct? That's what you said?
Correct. In the context of this report as an appraiser representing that, that would be my expectation.
Right. And that's consistent with DEM's August 2017 supplemental opinion in this matter. You're aware of that?
I can't say that I've seen that particular one, or I'd have to refresh my memory. I've seen a lot of opinions and pieces of paper.
Let me see if I can refresh your recollection on that one. This is the August 15, 2017 supplemental advisory opinion from DEM, which is Board Exhibit 1B. This is pages 14 and 14 to 15. I'll read this and then I'll ask you if that refreshes your recollection. If DEM finds that the applicant finds with a D, not finds the applicant, finds that the applicant has complied with the requirements of the applicable regulations, a permit will be issued for that proposed activity. The issuance of a permit indicates that DEM has determined that the nature and scope of the proposed activities are within standards for acceptable environmental impact established by state and federal laws and regulations. If upon the completion of the regulatory processes, the requisite environmental permits are issued, it is a formal declaration that the proposed facility has met the standards and criteria for acceptable harm to the environment as established in state and federal laws and regulations. Does that refresh your recollection about what DEM's opinion was?
You read a lot there.
Yeah.
That would be consistent. That would be consistent with an order that if it meets the standards, a permit would be issued, or said another way, in order to get a permit, you need to meet the standards.
Let's talk about perception. We had a little bit of an introduction to perception with an earlier witness today. On page 2, back to your executive summary, you're talking about what you're doing in chapter 4. Your executive summary is obviously a summary. What you say here is chapter 4 discusses the market value effects and methods of measuring the impact of the proposed facility. The measure of value used in this report is the empirical market value that can be provided by actions of buyers and sellers in the marketplace. This differs from the perceived impact that a proposed power plant has on surrounding property values, which is more emotional and subjective. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
All right. So, talking a little bit more about perception. Now back to the meat of your report, back to page 22. In measuring the effects of externalities, such as a power plant or high voltage transmission lines, which we refer to as HVTLs, on the value of property, it is useful to acknowledge and try to separate the difference between the empirical evidence versus the public perception. Correct?
That's not, I didn't follow your reading of it, but that sounds consistent, yes.
Okay. Still on page 22, there is typically a difference between the perceived value impact and the empirical evidence of such impact. Correct?
And there can be, yes.
So, if I understand what you're saying there, is typically what somebody thinks their property is worth, or what somebody thinks the amount of an impact to their property might be, is different from what the actual evidence reflects. Correct?
That is the gist of what that's saying.
Okay.
Yes.
And you talk about it again on page 23. Then there is the owner's perspective of how a new externality or disamenity. Again, when we're talking externalities and disamenities, there's a whole subset of the appraisal and valuation field that deals with the impact of detrimental conditions on property values. Correct?
Yeah. What page are you reading from?
I'm on page 23.
First paragraph or second?
Let me see. Give me a second and I'll get there. I put it all in my notes so I wouldn't have to go back and forth. First full paragraph, thank you. It says there is the market value perspective. That's where it starts.
I see that.
Okay, about the middle of the paragraph. Then there is the owner's perspective of how a new externality or disamenity will impact the market value of their property. This subjective view of the effects on market value is more personal and or emotional rather than empirical. Again, emotional rather than fact or evidence based, correct?
That's a possibility, yes.
Now you did a literature review in the course of generating your report?
I did.
All right. And this is also on page 23. It's just one line. Several studies were identified, most of which cited to work conducted by Professor Lucas W. Davis of the Haas School of Business, University of California, Berkeley. My colleague, Ms. Noonan's alma mater, as a matter of fact. But you read the Davis studies, correct?
Yes, that and other studies.
Right. We'll talk about those in a moment. But would you agree with me that you yourself have some issues with the Davis studies? Is that a fair statement?
I think there's conflicting information from the literature study to what we saw in the market or what we saw from our survey results.
And we'll get into more details on this, but the empirical evidence that you've found is inconsistent with the results of the Davis studies. Is that a fair statement?
That is correct.
So if we look at page 25 of your report, you say the Davis work assumes 3 to 7% decline in property values. You see where I'm reading from?
I do.
Okay. Is based only on the power plant. However, in the case of the proposed facility, now we're talking about Clear River, there is already a disamenity in the form of the BCS's Burrillville compressor station. Correct? That's what BCS means?
Yes, Burrillville compressor station.
In the form of the BCS and associated infrastructure. Therefore, it is difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish between the impact of the proposed facility and that currently present from the BCS. In addition, the literature suggests that over time, the impact of the decline is overcome or ignored by the market as the power plant or disamenity becomes the norm. So if I understand it, number one, it would be difficult but not impossible to determine a negative impact on property values from this facility at this location because it's it is completely, I can never pronounce inextricably, intertwined with the impact from the compressor station. That's number one. And number two, in any event, as people get used to it, any impact that might otherwise have existed disappears. Correct?
I did get two questions there, so you got me with a compound question.
Okay.
The other thing I would add is, the one thing we did conclude is that during construction there would be an impact beyond the Burrillville compressor station. But
We'll get to that.
But once constructed, that is correct, that this facility would be sharing the site with the existing Burrillville compressor station, which is an industrial facility. So that's the answer to number one. And then number two, there is the trend that the new becomes the norm as these facilities are integrated into a community or a location.
Okay. And I can assure you, we're going to get to the construction period part. I'm not going to avoid that one. Going back to page 2 again, your executive summary. I keep bouncing back and forth because your executive summary introduces, obviously, the meat of your report. So on page 2, you state that the town currently hosts the 560 megawatt Ocean State powered plant. You see where I'm referring to? The town currently hosts the 560 megawatt MW OSP natural gas fired plant. So it's one of two things.
It starts on page 1, but yes, it's
Okay.
that first full paragraph on page 2.
Right. And then at the end of that paragraph, this utility, and it refers to the original power plant was located on the northeastern edge of the town. Due to the existence of 2 natural gas transmission lines and a 345 kV high voltage transmission line in the town. This utility infrastructure is the reason Invenergy Thermal Development LLC proposed the facility in the town where it will be constructed on Spectra's 730-acre site, correct?
That's what it says.
All right. And I assume you're aware that statewide planning has itself confirmed in its advisory opinions filed in this matter that the presence of that utility infrastructure is particularly relevant to the determination that this is an appropriate site for the development of this project, correct?
Again, I've read a lot of those advisories, and if you want to show me that, I can comment on it. But
sure.
But clearly, the plan was proposed here because of the intersection of the gas and the transmission line.
I can do that. This is the August 10, 2017 statewide planning supplemental advisory opinion, which is Board Exhibit 2B. It's page 24. The subject is State Guide Plan Consistency Conclusion. However, although the area is relatively undeveloped, the project is adjacent to existing energy infrastructure systems, namely the Spectra Algonquin natural gas pipeline and compressor station, and National Grid's electrical transmission lines. One of the primary tenets of the state guide plan, found in several sections throughout, is that development should occur in close proximity to the underlying infrastructure that is needed to support it. In this instance, close proximity of the primary fuel source that is needed to produce the electrical energy and the transmission network that is needed to distribute it is particularly relevant. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, I mean, that would make sense, that's why the plan would be here, yes.
Okay. So let's talk about some other aspects of what Mr. Davis did. First of all, you're aware that Mr. Davis is not an appraiser, right?
Economist or professor, economist.
Right. Let's talk for a minute about what appraisers do. I have a big fat book here called The Appraisal of Real Estate 14th Edition. Are you familiar with this book?
I am.
All right. It's been described to me by Mr. Maroos as kind of the Bible of appraisal.
That's a fair characterization.
Okay. We have an excerpt from this one too. It's starting on page 95. There's a discussion on data collection, and here's what the authors say. In real estate appraisal, the quality and quantity of information available for analysis are as important as the methods and techniques used to process the data and complete the assignment. Therefore, the ability to determine the amount and type of data needed to answer the client's question, to distinguish between different kinds of data, to research reliable data sources, and to manage information is essential to effective appraisal practice. A little bit farther down, collecting accurate, reliable data remains an essential task because the conclusions of the analyses of appraisers are only as good as the data that supports those conclusions. And given that this is from the Appraisal Bible, I assume you agree with those statements?
I would agree with those statements.
So back to that perception issue that we talked about. And you point this out in your report. This is on page 25, and we're still talking about these Davis studies. In the period 2008 to 2011, Davis used restricted census microdata to examine housing values and rents for neighborhoods in the U.S. where power plants were opened during the 1990 time period. Is that correct?
Yes.
And just so we're clear here, this census microdata is from the census questionnaires that are collected from households, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Right. It's not a match pairs analysis like you and Mr. Maroos did in this case, correct?
No, it's more macro, but yes.
It's not based on interviews with real estate appraisers, real estate brokers, or with assessors, which is what Mr. Maroos did with the brokers and what you did with the assessors, correct?
It's a different source of data, yes.
Right. And the specific microdata that Mr. Davis used for housing prices, this is again from the census questionnaires, were self-reported. That means it was the people filling out the questions who provided this information. Self-reported to the question, how much do you think you could sell your home for if it were for sale? Right?
That's my understanding, and that's what was done to collect a large sample of data.
Well, so we're not just focusing on your understanding. I actually have both of the data studies that you've looked at. But I'll read you one quote, and I think you'll recognize this. This is from page 9 of the 2008 version, although the later version has the same quote. And you'll see, I think, that Davis himself recognized the limitations of what he did. The measures of housing values and rents in the census data are self-reported. With any self-reported information, one may be concerned about whether or not households are able to answer accurately. Housing values are self-reported in response to a question that prompts respondents to report how much they think their home would sell for if it were for sale. Does that sound familiar?
I'll take your word for it. It comes out of the study, yes.
Okay. Davis asserts another basic assumption that I'd like to ask you about. This is on page 10 of the 2008 version. In equilibrium, the price of housing near undesirable local facilities must be lower than the price of housing in other neighborhoods in order to attract households to these neighborhoods. Does that sound, do you recognize that?
That sounds reasonable.
And as an experienced appraiser, you know that's not right, don't you?
Well, I think all things being equal, that would make sense if that was the only variable.
All right. Well, we talked about the study of detrimental impacts on property values being a specific subset of the appraisal and the evaluation field, right?
There is, I guess you could characterize it that way, yes.
And are you familiar with Randall Bell's books on analysis of detrimental conditions? Real estate damages, applied economics and detrimental conditions. Real estate damages and analysis of detrimental conditions. And real estate damages, third edition, all by Randall Bell, PhD, MAI.
I can't say that I have them on my bookshelf, but
Well, are you aware that Mr. Bell is a recognized expert in the field of analyzing detrimental conditions?
I guess over my 25 years of doing this, I've read a lot of, articles and publications, whether they're those particular authors or those particular books, I don't know.
All right, well, let me see if you agree with this particular statement. This is out of this one, Real Estate Damages, Applied Economics and Detrimental Conditions, page 238. The fact that a property is impacted by a detrimental condition does not automatically mean that it has a material impact on the property's value. Detrimental conditions may or may not cause a material impact on value. Frequently, detrimental conditions have no material impact on value whatsoever. In the analysis of detrimental conditions, it is important that the appraiser be knowledgeable about available tools, properly select and apply those tools, avoid unproven or suspect methodologies, and ultimately have relevant market data to support opinions and conclusions. You agree with that, don't you?
I guess I agree with how you read it, and I agree that there are perceived detrimental conditions that may or may not have impact on property values.
And as a matter of fact, your conclusion in your report is that you couldn't find support for Davis's hypothesis, isn't that right?
In the set of data that we looked at, that is correct.
So,
that's not to say Davis was wrong, that's just to say that what we looked at was, we did not come to the same conclusion.
all right. Page 26 of your report. In our survey, there was no evidence that power plants negatively impact abutting property values long-term.
Could you just explain where you're reading from? You jumped quickly.
I'm sorry. It's at the top of page 26, starting the very first paragraph, starting in the second sentence of that paragraph, in our survey. There was no evidence? You see where I'm reading from?
I did.
Okay. In our survey, there was no evidence that power plants negatively impact abutting property values long-term. This is discussed more fully in Chapter 8. Therefore, while it is possible that there will be some impact to property values in the 3 to 7% range, with the greatest impact on residential properties closest to the proposed facility, it is difficult, if not impossible, to prove with empirical evidence that the effects are permanent or solely caused by the proposed facility. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
Okay. Now, you did look at, you gathered your own empirical evidence. Is that right?
We did. Yes, we did.
Okay. So going back to your executive summary, I hate to keep bouncing you back and forth, but it introduces everything else. On page 2, you talk about Chapter 6. You say, Chapter 6 addresses specific empirical evidence in the town. That's the town of Burrillville, obviously, correct?
Yes.
In the town, and the sale of properties in proximity to the OSP plant, as well as the existing BCS at the site. A review of several sales, both close to and away from the OSP plant and BCS improvements, did not identify any significant differences in the site values, correct?
Yes.
All right. And I assume you're aware that OSP is a dual fuel facility, gas and oil?
Yes.
Okay. You performed a match pairs analysis like Mr. Marus did?
I performed a match pairs analysis, yes.
Right. And just, why don't you explain what a match pairs analysis is, if you could?
At a high level, a match pairs analysis is comparison shopping. We try and look at two properties with hopefully one difference. In this case, what we were looking for was two properties that had difference in location. So you might have a 3-bedroom ranch with a comparable kitchen, comparable living room, and the only difference would be location. And you try and use the difference in sale price to say, is there a locational difference here? The same thing would be if we were to say, is there a difference between the value of a one-bedroom house and a four-bedroom house? If you went to a subdivision, you'd say, I have a four-bedroom house that sold for X. I had a two-bedroom house that sold for 90% of X. You could quantify the difference in those houses by looking at that matched pairs analysis. And so that's what we tried to do, which was look at properties in and around the existing Ocean State power plant, and looking at properties away from that power plant to see if there was any significant differences in property values. And then we did the same thing with the compressor station at the proposed site.
Okay. So going down to the bottom of page 2. This is part of your conclusion. Chapter 7 analyzed the assessed value of property abutters to the OSP plant and compared these with randomly selected properties through the town. That's your match pairs analysis, correct? Oh no, this is the assessment.
This is a little different. I'm sorry.
All right, we'll get there. But talking about this one, this review failed to identify any indication that the OSP plant had a negative impact on property values, correct?
The existing plant, that's correct.
Right. So if someone were to say land values immediate to the Ocean State Power Facility were impacted negatively, you found no empirical evidence to support that conclusion, right?
Based on the review of the assessment data, we did not know.
Right. For the record, that statement is in the January 28, 2016 letter from the Burrillville Conservation Commission that's attached as an exhibit to Mr. Pacheco's pre-filed testimony.
I'm sorry, and that statement from my report was it?
No, the statement I just read to you, I didn't make it up, it came from the Burrillville Conservation Commission. You also spoke to Burrillville's tax assessor, is it McCarr? Maker. Is that correct?
Former assessor.
Former assessor. All right. Well, you spoke to her at the time that she was the assessor.
Correct.
All right. And on page 41, you state that she confirmed to you that she, as of the time she was the official assessor of the town of Burrillville, that she did not believe that the OSP plant has any impact on the surrounding property values, correct? That's at page 41 of your report.
That's correct, yeah, I just wanted to make sure I was getting that citation correct.
Okay. Then you went further, actually you even went further than Mr. Bruce did. We may talk about that after this. Page 3 of your report, you say Chapter 8 discusses a survey of communities within a 30-mile radius of the town that host one or more power plants. You see where I'm reading from?
I do.
Okay. And here's what you say. Based on the results of this survey, the evidence suggests power plants have no long-term impact on property values in the neighborhoods that surround the plant or the town in general, correct?
That's what it says, yes.
I'm going to read you a statement. It's not from your report. I'm going to ask you a question about it. The proposed power plant will cause unacceptable harm to the town, its environment, its socioeconomic fabric, and its residents. And one of the reasons stated for that conclusion is the evaluation of homes in the immediate vicinity of the facility, and especially on the transportation route, and especially during construction. Now, based on your analysis, you've concluded there will not, in fact, be a devaluation of homes in the immediate vicinity of the facility. Stop there, correct?
And I think if you parse it out, that is one of the conclusions, is that we said long-term, that the new power plant would become the norm, but we did say near-term in construction there would be impacts, and that there's the possibility of diminution in property value at or around the plant.
Temporary.
And that it would negatively impacted on a temporary basis.
All right. I'll read you another statement. The tax assessor concluded that one, when we're referring to the tax assessor here, you understand it's really you since she adopted your report, correct?
That's my understanding.
All right. The tax assessor concluded that, one, based on a large-scale study conducted specifically on the effect on property values of power plants, the negative impact on property values could be in the 3% to 7% range. You didn't conclude that, did you?
That's one of the pieces of evidence we provided, but that is correct.
All right.
But that's what the study shows.
And the study you're talking about is the data study, right?
That's the study we say, yes.
Right. That's the study that's cited for the proposition that there could be a negative impact on property values in the 3% to 7% range, correct?
Yeah, for a limited distance around the power plant. I think we used a 2-mile radius.
And for the record, the statements I just read were from Mr. McElroy's opening statement. Let's see what you did conclude, Mr. Walker. Page 3, conclusions and potential impact. As a result of our research and analysis, it is our opinion that there is little evidence to suggest that the proposed facility will have a negative impact to property values in the town or on the abutting properties. Correct?
You were reading 40...
Page 3.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see it on page 3.
Page 3, conclusions and potential impact.
I just didn't see where you were reading. I'm sorry.
I'm moving too fast. You see, it's section...
It's the second full paragraph. You started that sentence.
Section 1.3. As a result of our research,
Yep.
there is little evidence to suggest that the proposed facility will have a negative impact on property values in the town or on the abutting properties, correct?
That's what it says.
Okay. Skipping a bullet, the literature suggests that within a 2-mile radius, a power plant may impact property values by 3 to 7%, with the greatest impact being to those properties closest to the plant. And that literature, again, is the data study, correct?
That is, yes, it's a data study.
Okay.
Sorry.
And just to go back to that, which in turn is based on individual perceptions and not an empirical data, correct?
Right, but again, you make it sound like we should just dismiss the data study. And again, I understand what it's based on, but it was also peer-reviewed and published several times. But yes, that's what it was based on: the survey data and a macroeconomic analysis of property values, property value impacts associated with power plants.
Well, let's see how your conclusions jive with Mr. Davis. Again, it's the next 2 bullet points on the same page. A review of sales and assessment data does not support the results of the large-scale survey. And again, when you're talking about the large-scale survey, you're talking about the data study, correct?
That is correct.
The town-specific analyses found no negative value impact for proximity to disamenities such as the OSP plant or the BCS, correct?
Correct.
The next one. A survey of other communities that host power plants indicates that these communities could not identify any negative impact on property values surrounding the power plant, correct?
That is what it says, yes.
All right. So let's talk about construction period. You do talk about the possibility of a limited temporary impact during construction, and just with respect to the properties along Wallam Lake Road, directly across from the facility entrance, correct?
At the time of this study, that's what we look at.
Right.
Again, this was prior to the new revised water plan, but yes, that would be the construction impacts.
All right. We'll talk about the water plan in a minute. And this conclusion is at the bottom of page 3. And what you say here, during the construction phase, it is likely that the properties along Route 100, directly across from the entrance, will experience lower marketability and potential negative impact to market value. This impact is not anticipated to be permanent, but only during the construction phase. That's correct?
That's what it says, yes.
Okay. Have you filed or have you provided an update to this report?
I have not.
And as a matter of fact, in response to Mr. McElroy's initial introduction of you today, you confirmed that you have no changes or corrections to this report, correct?
Not to this report, no.
Okay. Is an impact like this construction phase impact that you're talking about limited to the construction of a power plant, or would it apply to any major construction project?
Well, it would apply to any major construction project of this magnitude.
Okay.
This one just happens to be in Burrillville.
So you do know that this location is in the F5 zoning district in Burrillville?
Yeah, I'll take your word for that. I can't say I recall what the zoning is.
Well, are you aware that by right development in the F5 includes residential development on 5-acre lots?
Again, I'd have to go back and look at the zoning code.
If you'll take my word for it.
The zoning code says what the zoning code says.
Right. So I'll represent to you that the zoning code says that a principal permitted use is residential on 5-acre lots.
If that's what it says.
So if a developer were to, let's say this plant doesn't get built, and Spectra were to sell its entire 730-acre parcel to a residential real estate developer who wanted to build 120 single-family homes on 5-acre lots over a period of, say, 5 years, would that have an impact in terms of the construction traffic?
Again, I haven't studied that. I don't know that it has the same peak magnitudes and the same type of infrastructure coming in. It would have an impact, clearly.
And assume for the sake of argument that another principal permitted use in the F5 is a hospital. Would the construction of a hospital and the construction traffic associated with that have an impact of the type that you're expressing a concern about regarding construction traffic for this project?
Again, I don't know what kind of possibility you're proposing, but I will say that a power plant is somewhat unique in the magnitude of its construction and the size of the construction vehicles. The amount of civil work necessary to develop this type of infrastructure tends to be more significant than your standard commercial development, industrial development, residential development. But clearly, construction is construction. I just think this would have a greater impact.
Which would go away once construction is over, correct?
As with all construction, but yes.
All right. And you're aware, obviously, that Invenergy has, at the request of the town, entered into a property value guarantee agreement structure, correct?
I'm aware of that agreement, yes.
Have you seen the draft agreement?
I have.
It provides for an appraisal process in the event an individual property owner claims or believes or perceives that their property values have been negatively impacted, correct?
Right, I believe it's a two-part agreement. I think it's one, the property owner can opt out of the agreement for a fee. I believe the fee is $5,000 or $6,000, or they can go through an appraisal process for the damage on their property. And again, there was a series of properties in Burrillville identified to deal with that.
And are you aware that that this property value guarantee obligation was entered into at the request of the town?
That's my understanding.
And it was entered into at the request of the town in conjunction with the town's entry with Invenergy into a payment in lieu of tax agreement?
I believe those were two separate and distinct items. Property tax agreements tend to be completely separate from any other types of agreement, but they may have been negotiated simultaneously, but typically pilot agreements are kept separate from all the other development agreements.
And the specific intent of this property value guarantee, since there won't be any impact according to your analysis after construction is over, is to address the possibility that there may be negative impacts during construction, correct?
Right, and I think that's consistent with our findings. There's some common sense to it. You know, there's a big construction project. There's going to be some impacts. We don't think there's going to be long-term impacts, but there could be some long-term impacts. Therefore, there has been there's been the property value guarantee entered into to look at the possibility of property value impacts.
If I may have just a moment, Madam Chair. That's all I have, Madam Chair.
Other questions?
to have a little redirect, this is the time.
Let's see if we have.
Meredith, if you would like to start this time, feel free.
I actually don't have any questions at this time. Thank you.
Okay. I have a few for you, Mr. Walker. First, to state the obvious, you did this before the new water plan was submitted early in 2017, correct?
That is correct.
And then on the section on traffic, you say the traffic is minimal. That's page 14 of your plan. From what you know, does the water plan and the trucking and the water change that conclusion?
It can't make it any better. It's unusual for a power plant of this magnitude to utilize water in the way that Invenergy is going to use water at the plant. I can't think of another one that I've looked at that does it this way. And again, it's not so much when it's operating on natural gas, it's when it fires diesel fuel or ultra low sulfur diesel fuel that it needs to replenish its on-site water tanks. The tanks are approximately 2 million gallons. I think that's a 3-day supply of water. One number that we came up with, and this was after this report was done, was that the trucking to replenish the tanks over a period of time could be consistent with the same level of traffic as during construction. 20 trucks per day, both water, diesel fuel, and the demineralization trailer and other materials necessary to replenish the plant. But again, that's after this study. But the only thing I would say is it can't make it any better.
So if you think that the property values could be reduced during construction for a variety of reasons, are you saying that the water, trucking in of water, would change your ultimate conclusion about no impact on property values in the long run?
It would be hard to say. I guess it would be hard to quantify, but it can't be better. I don't think it could be better. How's that? You add more traffic, the likelihood is things are worse than they are better.
It sounds like you're familiar with the property value guarantee agreement.
I am somewhat familiar. It's been a while since I've read it, but I am somewhat familiar with it.
I just wanted to know if you thought that it was adequate.
I think it's reasonable. I think any agreement like this, you have to weigh pros and cons. I know the town did a fair amount of work negotiating it. Maybe there's things that could be improved in it. I think one of those that was an issue that might have been outstanding was, don't know that any of the properties along the transmission line had been incorporated into the property value guarantee. But I think, again, it was a negotiation between the parties. Could be made better, maybe. The one thing might be those properties along the transmission corridor.
You heard Mr. Roos testify, correct?
I did.
Have you had the same experience that he explained where people opt out, but he's never really seen anyone avail themselves of this opportunity?
I'm only aware of a few property value guarantees, and I can't say that I'm aware of any where they were extensively utilized. For example, I believe north of this plant in the town of Blackstone, Massachusetts, there was a property value guarantee, and I don't know that it was heavily utilized. Same thing with Bellingham, Massachusetts, that was just north of this facility. I believe they had a property value guarantee. Again, I don't believe it was heavily utilized.
I wanted to ask a couple questions about the Davis study. First, does an owner's perspective on what the value of that owner's property is have any corroboration or relationship to the value?
Well, I think it goes to the sample size. Again, it was a study that was reported on self-reporting, so everyone would have to say, I think my house is approximately worth this. Now, if you take a sample of 10, you say take a sample of 20, that may skew it. I think you gain some validity by the size of the sample. And again, the thing with the data study I would say too is it was published by Berkeley, and he had done prior work in this subject area prior to, I believe it was the 2008 study. There are older studies, again, I don't believe there are any newer studies than the 2008 or even older studies to look at. So it is limited, and the only thing I would add is there's some other studies. There's a gentleman by the name of Jim Chalmers that does work on transmission lines, the impact of transmission lines. And again, that's consistent with that, 3 to 7% range is my recollection.
Sounds like you're saying it's limited, but it's the best study that you could find.
Well, I think it's the best study I could find, and I mean, we weren't creating the literature, we were going to the public arena and finding what literature had been developed, what had been published. And again, I would just say, typically you don't get a paper like that published without some level of peer review. So obviously some people could say, yeah, I don't believe this study, but at the same time, some people say, well, it might not be perfect, but it's an indication of what could happen.
Well, Mr. Maroux said, quote, the data study conclusions are of questionable validity, unquote. Do you agree with that? Again,
You can draw that conclusion. I won't necessarily say it's wrong, because it is opinion, but the fact that in my understanding, it was peer-reviewed and published gives it some credibility. I don't think you can just dismiss it out of hand. How's that?
Fine. This may be for later on. I noticed that you wrote on your report, page 18, that the facility is dry-cooled, so there's no plume. And I wondered if that applies when the facility is running on oil. And I'll ask you, but that's probably a question for later.
Yeah, my understanding is, so historically, power plants utilize wet cooling and wet cooling towers. So you cool the facility, and then you expose all that cooling water to the air, and you get these big plumes of evaporation. This facility is basically using, for lack of a better term, big radiators, and so you won't get that same steam from this facility.
And I'll ask that question later to the applicant. We also have a date where we're going to be talking about noise quite a bit with experts. So I just note that you said that the noise impact will be lower than the compressor station is now.
Yeah, and again, I didn't mean to interrupt you if I did.
Oh no, I just was asking if that was correct.
And one thing that's come up is, my understanding is the compressor station has gone through a changing of the engines. They've gone from reciprocating engines to centrifugal compression. And again, that may have changed that set of assumptions.
Okay. So that might be another area.
But that's I'm not a noise
Yeah,
expert. I'm citing noise experts in that report.
Those are all my questions. Thank you.
I don't think I have any questions on that.
Yes, just a little bit. Mr. Walker, Mr. Blazer has been using the reference Mr. Lucas throughout his questioning, but is it your understanding that David Lucas is a PhD in economics?
That is my understanding, yes, sir.
He's also the distinguished professor in business and technology at the Haas School of Business at the University of California at Berkeley.
That is correct.
And this study that he published was a national study?
That's correct.
That's all I have, thank you.
Mr. McElroy, just to correct the record, I think you said Lucas, not Davis.
I'm so sorry, I did, and I
Okay, so we're talking about
apologize.
Dr. Davis.
Yes, thank you very much for that.
Some very brief recross, Madam Chair. And just for the record, Director Coit, it's because his name is Lucas Davis.
Well, you had me going too, so.
Yeah.
We all know what we were talking about.
We all know what we're talking about.
Thank you, Mr. Mike.
Touche. Mr. Walker, in response to Director Coit's questions about the Davis study, you said, I was writing quickly, I think what you said was it's the best we have.
I didn't, I might have used that, maybe that was the wrong characterization, but.
you do know there are other studies that address impacts of nuclear facilities. You've seen some of those, haven't you?
I may have. I mean, again, I have looked at a lot of plants. I've looked at the impact on plants in various communities, kind of what we do. I've seen studies that say there's a big impact. I've seen studies that say there's a small impact. So there are, micro studies, which I think would be like the nuclear studies you're referring to, as opposed to the macro studies like the Lucas study, the Davis study. I'm sorry.
That's okay. We'll call it Lucas for now. I feel like I'm on a first name basis with it. If we just keep using that best we have for now, if we want a different description, the best we have from Davis ends with plants that have been built as of 1990, correct?
That is correct. The plants are old.
So, and it included coal plants?
It did include some coal plants, but there were natural gas as well.
Certainly nothing state-of-the-art as the type that we're talking about here, correct?
And again, I don't mean to quibble with you, but I guess state-of-the-art in what sense?
Modern combined cycle gas plant.
Okay, so we have had combined cycles like Ocean State, which is 1990 vintage. Generally, you could look at that and say not a lot has changed on the one hand. We're still using a combustion turbine to spin a generator. The exhaust from that combustion turbine is coming from a recovery steam generator that's making steam. So the process hasn't changed, but I will agree that the emissions are lower. You're typically not using wet cooling, you're typically using evaporative cooling, etc. So there have been some changes, but you still have the powertrain, you still have, all of the site infrastructure, if you will.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned OSP and the fact that it dates back to 1990. I would suggest to you, and tell me if you disagree, given the circumstances and what we're dealing with here, that the best we have would be what you and Mr. Maroos have done in this matter. Would you agree with that?
I guess the best we have. You have to characterize that a little bit better. I'm sorry.
Well, for example, you commented on OSP being somewhat similar to the type and vintage of plant that Mr. Davis looked at. You concluded that there has been zero negative impact from the OSP facility, correct?
That is correct. With that one plant, that is correct.
That's all I have.
Any further? Thank you very much. Now, Council, is that the end of the list for today? Is there anything that we need to go over before we meet again tomorrow? Very well. I believe we blew it better. Back here tomorrow at 9:30. Correct?